Please listen to the teachings this evening with the intention that you're going to listen to these teachings in order to pacify all of the causes and effects of suffering in the mind streams of all living beings. So the causes of suffering are their karma and afflictions, and those karma and afflictions bring about the resultant state of suffering. So in order to pacify all of those causes and results of suffering, then I'm going to listen to these teachings. So generate that motivation.
So, and then this one, that so my share of the carriage just number scientific. Ani nyamlang right. Tela ani hila said number ni yore taking on any shinade mashagos.
And so what I'm going to be discussing this evening is amongst the two main types of practices or types of meditations in Buddhism. We have two, which are called, one is called calm abiding or shamatha, and one which is called superior insight or profound insight or vipassana. And so of those two types of practice, I'm going to be talking about the first, which is a calm abiding practice.
And in the Shini setting in the Tamagi Ye Tipani Zonde, and it got the Yagita, be teaching Tatuagba Tamji, Latinidi, Shini in Rodhiores.
And calm abiding is something which finds its beginnings or is included even within the most fundamental basic practices or the fundamental vehicle of Buddhism and continues onwards into the highest levels of tantric practice.
And in this one, that Shini data Timumba the number keep married, Timumba the Yore, number Corona ye tipata the Chiniyore. So just Sambata the Jenny, Sangata the Jenny. The Koranti, the so Chetanga would in Ramadamambu, Chetanga to get Ratangi, and Hiniri.
And calm abiding is something that we call a common practice because it isn't particular to Buddhism. It is shared in common with both Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions, and is also common in all approaches, all of the levels and spiritual approaches of Buddhist practice, starting with what we call the foundational vehicle or the Theravada teachings, all the way through the Bodhisattva teachings and into the Tantric teachings. Though there are some different ways that it's put into practice, some different forms that it might take, that practice of calm abiding in general is a common practice amongst all of these.
I think that's what the that thing number Mahimba Timbaina. And Kase make it end of a day, take Nugunavutina take it, and a Kase take Metunavutina and take Kacenti, you des a Mahimba. Make the same word of what it's a trotting into the Mahimba. Don't take in Mahimba. Takes a tell a Chadang Kelos of Mahimba, or the day then. Gom did I push in each other yours.
And so for even a non-Buddhist, practice of calm abiding, they're going to use, just as general in calm abiding, you're going to use some kind of support, some kind of object for your practice. So even in a non-Buddhist approach to calm abiding, you might use a common object, such as, a pen or even a flower, but somewhere where it's not moving around. You want your object not to be moving around. And you also want it to not be reflecting a lot of light. And so you want something that's comfortable to look at, not something that is awkward or uncomfortable to look at, and also something which is not going to provoke some kind of emotional reactions of attachment or aversion.
Gevate so ya so depart so pa jangya ge chedela ani mixe shini tende ta na sanji gen do ta so ta bin do so pe mo buten yoris.
And so even in the foundational teachings of Buddhism, in the Hinayana or Theravada approach of Buddhism, in the Vinaya or the monastic discipline or the discipline sutras, there is a practice called the calm abiding of sojong. Sojong is a practice which is in the monastic tradition is a ritual of increasing the power of your virtues or rectifying or fixing or improving the power of your virtues and purifying any kind of misdeeds or wrong actions that you've done. And there's a special calm abiding practice that characterizes or accompanies that practice of Sojong.
And then I think it's a chambu. That's what I'm here. The benefit of that China. The nation here of the Timberland, the moon number of Shitini, Thomas Nichajana, the Chapa the drugs in the song.
And so then, like in the Bodhisattva level of practices, in the Mahayana practices, in Shantideva's way of the Bodhisattva, he says, first, by knowing that the special insight, vipassana, which is thoroughly endowed with calm abiding, will overcome your afflictive emotions, then you should first seek out and apply yourself in practice of calm abiding, and then you will attain the state of supreme joy beyond all attachment.
So anything I think that ya sanga the so on a penata, Jerem Tar, then digging on the knee, Kota Shini,
and then in the Vajrayana tradition, then in the creation stage practices, there is a powerful practice of calm abiding within that.
Tende ta de ta ngaso pe na nangba da uji bai no ani ti ye ti bai nanda ti ba chemo bai nanda zo de ko le de ba de shu chemo da uji ya yo.
But if one was practicing in the Buddhist tradition, whether they're practicing in the foundational vehicle or Theravada level of approach, or whether they're practicing in Mahayana approach, the more common and more powerful practice is to focus upon an image or a form of the Buddha. Though I said that the primary practices of observing or using the body or the physical form of the Buddha as an object, there are also practices which are a calm abiding practice focusing upon the enlightened form, those which focus upon enlightened speech, and others which focus on the enlightened mind. And so the important point that I'm communicating right now, what I'm trying to get across, is just letting you know what kinds of calm abiding practice they are and in what kind of context they might be practiced.
아니 다 저 신이세 데 간트질을 된 것은 그랬어요. 아니 개비 미바라 세티바스.
And then what is the general character of calm abiding? How do we identify a calm abiding practice? What are its characteristics? So the definition of that would be a single pointed focus upon a virtuous object.
아니 다 개와 세금이 김사에 가서도 아니 나소라 대마인비 제지바 망보요래 더차 제지바 해동 제지바 또모 제지바 라소바다도 제지바 빼 망보죠다 딘디기 나노니 아니 디 기비미 바라 제지바세 대고고레스.
So what's the point in saying single pointed focus on a virtuous object? And the reason for that is because we have single pointed states of mind on many non-virtuous states of mind in our normal day-to-day life, such as we have moments of single-pointed focus on our desires, the objects of our desires, on the objects of our anger, on the objects of our ignorance, and so forth. And so among all the things that we could be single-pointedly focused on, we want to emphasize or focus upon something virtuous.
And then this one, Nama Bendo Chahido Tomana Subala, maybe the Karishini Chagi Mare. So that Gomja to be in Chago Maricena. The cup didn't need who you already in a young and Jima de la Sempe, Tugro de Gijazo. Giving me pallet need there, they get the name Tuzezo, your Marico, the dates on the Hinichati.
And so, what's the reason why single pointedly focused upon those other objects, the objects of our attachments, our desires, our anger, our suffering, and so forth? Why are those not calm abiding? And the reason is because when we focus upon those single-pointedly, they might be single-pointed in that moment, but the single-pointed focus upon them actually disturbs our mind more. And so that is not a calm abiding. And so when we focus upon a virtuous object, it not only does not disturb our mind, but it actually brings about a foundation of peace in our mind.
아니 다 베네 니제 카드 차고서 다 베네 가서 남바 드는 남바 이야기는 막 얘기하기. 아니 내 이야기는 희용데 다 베나 가서 남비다고 지나 조다 산지가 걸 때비 다 힘이데 조도 세지 힘이 된다고 이야기요래. 디치온데 베나다 산지게 되는데 그거다 딘소벌 때는 단다발 때는 때는다 힘깔 때는다 근데 신직 때온도 아니 바코데 앞에 시바 된대신이 교교래라 소소 델 맥비 되는 제지 니움비깔 아니 가서 샘데 니데 니차데 체체는 로이지 마도 니비 욕되나 되는 야 초부요 말이스.
And so how is it that focusing upon this virtuous object in a Buddhist practice, I'm speaking here, just on the foundation, you just assume that my discussion from here on out is from the perspective of a Buddhist practice of calm abiding. How is it that it enacts a calm abiding? How does it bring your mind to a state of rest? And so primarily the primary practice that we begin with in Buddhist calm abiding is what we call a calm abiding with characteristics or with an object. And we most commonly use the object, or as our object, we most commonly use the physical form of the Buddha, like an image of a Buddha. And so when we focus upon the Buddha, there's different parts of the Buddha's body that we might focus on the spot at the center of the Buddha's forehead. It's called the primordial wisdom tuft, or the timeless awareness tuft. Or at the Buddha's heart, at the Buddha's throat. Anyway, there's different techniques for that, different places that you might focus your attention on the Buddha's body. And when you focus on those, the image of the Buddha himself, the Buddha is very peacefully, calmly sitting in his posture. And when our mind comes to rest and focus single pointedly upon that object, that brings our mind into a restful state. And from building that restful state with the meditation, that focus upon the Buddha's body does not lead our mind into a disturbed state, but rather one of peace and restfulness.
아니 딱 델라스가 지구 예바이나 느끼오래. 다 이나 지배 상해성이라고 멍보 많이 봐. 그러면 멍보 제대로 많이 봐. 지다 대고 매봤던데 많이 봐. 근데지 때지나.
And it's also said that it's also okay to focus on other, enlightened forms. It doesn't just have to be like Shakyamuni Buddha. But what it says in the text is that you shouldn't focus upon something that has too many kind of complicated designs, something that has too much going on, that's kind of distracting, like so many different objects, so many different images and so forth, but something which is very simple and very easy to focus upon.
that did so red and it's and they are portava my matava my netava my mota it takes a maxim of my Jana Yavares.
And you also should place it in a place which is neither too high up in your field of vision nor too low down, too far away or too close, and also not somewhere that's so dark that it's difficult to see. So you need to put it in a place, just to summarize, that's very easy and very comfortable to look at.
Yeah, that thing also me. And
so that is what I'm talking about, is the support which we are going to be focusing our attention on.
Aninta chetanro chikandrese no. Aninta namba hijana the tomar golati jamro. That's so say pechurong so you current of jamro in a jamro simchi. The so no che.
And the way that you would begin this practice, again, this is from a purely Buddhist practice standpoint. You would recite the verses of taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, whichever ones you might know or you're familiar with.
Lily sent the Yadala Tosumatabe, Ying Sumatabe, King Trunk they were no mind, but my Mate, Papa,
and then after you have taken refuge and generated bodhicitta, then you need to just rest calmly, relaxed, you need to feel really settled in your body, that your mind is present within your body, that your mind is not wandering elsewhere or distracted elsewhere or disturbed by other external objects or ideas or thoughts, that you're really calm and really settled and present.
아니, 다 중바이나 다 나서디. 내가 담바 산지 좀 된디 아버지 야바이나 다 될라. 기 문니기야 샘땡이 대파가 오지 제지. 다 공급에는 아마다 가세리시니 남니 아니 타마 아니 뭔가 좀 상지바 나기지니 상지니 샘지 탐지 로된 남바나 다그 양제기 인 삼비게 꾸는데 최대야 롱으로 지제.
And if you're able to do this, then if you're using an image of the Buddha, for example, then you should really have some feeling, you should feel this inspiration of faith from the depths of your heart when you're looking upon the image of the Buddha. And you should think of this very particular kind of motivation when you begin the practice, that just as the Buddha accomplished this practice of calm abiding, and then ultimately that calm abiding empowered his practice such that he was able to reach the state of perfect Buddhahood where he could benefit all beings. I'm going to practice in that same way and have this sense of faith in the Buddha as you begin the practice.
콩 넘버 닝데다 신이기다 라마라고도 되니 차데다 림포드 라제
And then the Buddha, he was a prince and he was there, and then he gained this sense of renunciation and left his kingdom. And when he left, then his first two teachers, his first two gurus or lamas were a lama named Rinpoche and another named Hachap. And so they taught him the practice of calm abiding.
다 데레 손자가라 다 데나기 진당 가서 토마를 가서 신이되게 이해돼. 아니 신이디 강단에 데나 함통돼야 자지. 덴데스 제고래. 데 손자 땅에 나 덴데스 진이다. 같이 제동도 덴데스 지. 아니 니니마 약토 고스니. 데니 산지는 도는데 송어래 데지 고데 기미닝디 남바랑 되면도디. 같이 디 약토 고지.
And so this calm abiding, then, we build this foundation of calm abiding. And then once we've built the foundation of calm abiding, then we can add to it the practice of insight, of vipassana. But anyway, now that we have gotten to this point, now it's time to talk about how you actually focus your mind. How is it that you place your mind on the object? How is it that you rest your mind with the object? And that's where we come into these 9 methods. And so we have the 9 ways of resting the mind, sometimes called the 9 ways of placing the mind. And so those were taught in the sutras. And there are also not specifically Buddhist instructions. These are just general practices for attaining calm abiding. So we advertised that I was going to teach these 9 methods, right?
And then this one's like a go say the then same joke, June the joke, landing joke, never joke, power zedo, hiver zedo, number hiver zedo, say the zedo, never joke was in it.
And so those 9 are resting the mind. And so you could, anywhere it says rest here, you could also place the word placing the mind or putting the mind like on the object. For example, you could say that as an alternate translation, just so you know. So those 9 are resting the mind longer, continuously resettling the mind, fully settling the mind, taming the mind, pacification of the mind, complete pacification of the mind, one-pointedness, and resting in equanimity.
Honestly. That the good about the young Denny Chum Lozon Tata, Cassie Chumchen, but Chumchen, Lola, Annie, Sem Niba, Niba Cepala, Som, Niba, temperature bala som temperature bala som zeni tendency som ji go tena yin dos.
And then in the great Chim is a person's name, in his exposition of the Abhidharma, he divides these 9 into 3 sets of 3. And so the first 3 are bringing rest to a mind which is not at rest. The second 3 are stabilizing that restful state. And then the final 3 are gaining freedom of that restful state, or from within that restful state, liberating that restful state.
Let's say, any tendency hong bangala ta kambo tene mani padi never chibi tapsam ye das.
So first, I'm going to talk about these first 3 methods, which are the 3 methods which will bring an unrestful mind into that state of rest. And so that is resting the mind longer, and continuously resettling the mind. So the first one, resting the mind or placing the mind, is just as I said before. Let's say that you are using an image of the Buddha, and you place your mind or rest your mind on some point. Like I said before, there's different points you could focus on the Buddha's body.
He makes him something like that. So we make them better taking it. Senji comes a lot of this.
And so normal way of talking about this, the way that we focus our attention on the object, is to say that we use our mind, our eyes, and the object. And so the way that this is talked about is that you bring your awareness, your mind, your attention to your eyes. And then with your eyes, you use your eyes to focus your mind on the object. So it's like you imagine that your mind goes to your eyes, and then with your eyes, your mind goes to the object. So, and you imagine that it's just like, like a nail is stabbed right into the object, or like threading a needle. It's like very precise and sharply placed on the object. And you also shouldn't really intensely or tightly kind of restrict or constrain or hyper concentrate your body, speech, and mind when you're doing this. And then together with this list of the 9 ways of resting the mind, there's also in the same document that was posted on the website, there's a list called the 6 powers. And the first one is called listening and study. And so what that means here is that in this context, you need to know the method for how to place your mind on the object, how to rest your mind with the object. So you need to study that. You need to learn that from a teacher that has experience of that themselves.
Takes a same drum na mato tigi joke to Kuyomari. Jimsen Kase Namjing also same the pet. Kasa Kala Tanga Yorata, but the Langan Yamada chat here. They chat the Kala Ani, Naso Kase need to Yomari. Then that's what days called sort of captain and drummy. Pa Tata Tena Giri, they Kase, he makes him the sort of band taking it. But then the way the color drummed into be this easy given on this job.
And further down that list, you'll see another list of 4 things called the 4 mental engagements. And I'm going to argue a little bit with the translation of the first one here, because it says tightly focused engagement. And I would just say it doesn't really say tightly. It just says kind of concentrated engagement or focused engagement, not tightly. That's kind of a overstating what it says in the Tibetan, and kind of conflates the issue if it says tight. So basically what Khen Rinpoche is explaining is that as a beginner, if we don't concentrate our attention, just like I gave you the example of focusing your mind to your eyes and your eyes to the object, just like, like a nail or like threading a needle, something like that. If there isn't some sense of concentrated effort, then our minds are hyper habituated to just distraction. Our minds are wandering all over the place and very distracted. So if we don't put a little bit of concerted effort and we don't concentrate our attention and our effort, then we won't be able to focus on the object. So in the beginning, in these first sections, the mental engagement we're working with is this concentrated or focused engagement.
That's what I change Yato going on a Pamboya and a top dropping on a Pamboya. And easy jigging on a Tambo, here they do the turn door with this on a Tamboya, cargo, you may see. And they like I said, same the drum bit of the guni, then a yell.
So to summarize what I'm saying here is we've got the first of all three of these lists that we're working with. So we have this method for how to focus our attention. We use the power of hearing. So we learned that from a qualified teacher and we know how to do that. Then when we're actually ready to engage in it, we engage in it with this first of the four mental engagements by focusing or concentrating our attention on the object. Okay, so let's move into the second of these 9 methods. And so then it says resting the mind longer. And so just all this means is that we've already placed our mind in the object and we're trying to maintain that continuity of the awareness or hold that single pointed attention for a longer period of time. And so this is like an example I could give for this is like when a young child sees something kind of incredible, they see it and they get excited that they saw it. And when they see it, they kind of like, they say, oh, I saw it. And they get kind of excited and distracted away from it. So what's talking about in the second point is not that, but that you see it and you just calmly remain with it.
Let's say, and that got the top problem, the some bit upset. The some bit upset that I'm about to someone going to hit her. And some big going when D, he needed Nina Peto career. Manina Joe career. He needs it that career. He carried the Gombian. That's what the sort of Yapu, the Jenny, copied the some bit of the going to Chavaji.
And so the second of the 6 powers, which accompanies this second method of resting the mind longer, is the power of reflection. And so we already learned through the listening and study, the first of the 6 powers, how to do the practice. We learned the instructions and how to focus the mind or place the mind with the object. And now we want to think about this, like, why would I even want to meditate on this? What is the proper way of meditating on this? What kind of benefit will I get from this? What are the faults in not doing that? And gain some kind of trust or certainty about the practice. And of the 4 mental engagements, we're still working with the concentrated engagement or focused engagement, because still as a beginner in these first couple of the methods, we still have to have this diligent, focused attention.
Let's say, somebody comes and land you see about land selling us a somebody pie, young jet dicker secas land, young jet secas, young jet so jacket, pass him the rocky young jet say, land you say.
And then the third of the 9 ways is continuously resettling the mind. And what it means by resettling is that when we're trying to rest our mind in the object, our mind is going to keep wandering off from the object. We're going to keep getting distracted. And so to resettle means when it gets distracted, we bring it back, we replace it, we bring it back and resettle it on the object again and again.
ngune tani ge de kama che de la pe kala khop do lang so taxi ka se de jong do che che.
So our mind is really strange, isn't it? It won't sit still for even a single minute. We try and rest it somewhere and it immediately wants to run off somewhere else.
Ane ni nam ju she de ge kun che long che nam jong ge de ne ta ta di rang ro semi rang ro ge na no. Pro ta sen goduk ngamung ga se. Ta nga su ge tropo ta se ke jam ne. Ta nga su ge sem de be de ngune be de ngamung na yi goduk ngamung na yi ngamung de pa tang na yang ko pa ro ho sa ma ba ko yang ka se ya na ko ma de ru che ko sa ma ko ko ran de jam chi ro de ko ko sa nga su sem de goduk de res ya na de ru che ma tang na ru che ma
And so I bring up this example a lot. Longchen Rabjam in his text, which is called The Natural Freedom of the Nature of Your Mind, he says that our mind is very contrarian. And he gives the example that it's like a camel. And so he says that camels are, if you try to get them to move forward, they'll just want to sit still. And the second you try and get them to sit down, then they start pacing around. And our mind is just like that. As soon as we try and get our mind to sit still and rest, it starts getting distracted and wandering around. And as soon as we try and apply it to actually do some job, we try and actually, use our mind, then it becomes lazy and doesn't want to do it.
And then pe nyen bo hiu chos ta mani nga su ge sem de ga ran ren do de kun jian jian bo kan zhen de wo de ji de pe de ya ya ra yin sang sang de chos.
And when I first received those teachings, I thought they were really incredible. I thought it was really, really eloquent. I was just thinking, like, how did Longchen Rabjam come up with such a great example?
Yeah. That didn't get it. I saw the pedding as a send the Gamona Gide, Patan and Ruruchema, Yana and cook as a Deruchi, my young Juti. The Ina, that was Kali, young Janju,
and so our mind really is like a camel. When we try and get it to sit still, then it wants to get up and walk around. And when we want to put our mind to work, then it just wants to sit there and not do it. And so, but through this practice of continuously resettling the mind, bringing it back again and again, then slowly we can develop that power of rest. And so some people, they get really annoyed with themselves because they're meditating and they get distracted and they're like, oh man, I'm thinking again. I got distracted again. And they start getting upset with themselves. And that's really not helpful. Don't do that. If you get distracted, just bring your mind back. That's great. That's all you need to do. But otherwise, if you are judging yourself or criticizing yourself for thinking or being distracted, it just makes the situation worse.
Then kama te chonga sa gom jabiana ani yamba ta ma jabati tiga ta ko semba de yin zubo de kala de lurios.
And so then of these 6 powers at this point, we're working with the power of mindfulness. And so without mindfulness, without the power of mindfulness, then we might spend an entire hour thinking we're meditating when we were actually only really focused on the object for 10 or 15 minutes. And the rest of the time we were just sitting there distracted, not even knowing that we were distracted because we've lost that power of mindfulness. And so, our body's sitting on the cushion and we're, in this posture or kind of looking like we're meditating, but without mindfulness, we may or may not even be actually meditating.
Anita develop easy no changing to be existing door. Ko pa chelo yore yang chen job, chelo yore yang job, what this.
And then of these 4 mental powers or 4 mental engagements, we're working with interrupted engagement. And I would translate this more as interruption and then engagement. So what that means is that there's a distraction. We'll get distracted. We'll have an interruption to the continuity of our focus. And then we re-engage, we engage again. And that's the process. You get interrupted, you engage. You get interrupted, you engage.
And that this one that never tops on the dead was.
And so those first three are the three methods for bringing an unrestful mind to rest.
Send ja. And Tele is June to it. Young June chain of Shona young gets in Jovati.
And so those three methods, again, to summarize, are first, you place your mind or rest your mind on the object. Then you rest it for longer. You try and hold it there for longer. And then when that restfulness or that, when your mind is staying with the object, but then that is cut off, it is interrupted, then you re-engage.
That is so copsala, Unitani Carchimo, Tisum disobey Carchimore, Gom Kupati Jamna, the name Moyama Kupachado,
Mion.
the Gom Kupat and the Jamna, the Seba de Kalikalima Kupachado.
And so at this point, it's really important for us to have studied and contemplated the teachings, because otherwise, if we do what we call idiot's meditation, it means meditating without actually knowing what you're doing, then that type of meditation can just make your mind more dull. It can make your mind kind of like dull and dumb.
And so good dose, the Yagudos dose and the sad doy dotty, that the nature dodo see that, meeting any dodge hard over this time. Going up with Jamma here and meditate.
So, like we say, if people don't know how to meditate, but they're trying to meditate without actually knowing what they're doing, then they become like a rock.
Oh, yeah.
Like lifeless, like a rock, you could say maybe. Rock dumb, that dull sen and chick this muk dong in right.
Let's say the Desiata, Naso, Dinimata, the neighbor that part is a bamboo,
and then the fourth, fifth, and sixth of these 9 powers are those methods which will stabilize the restful state that we've gotten to in the first 3 methods. So the fourth is fully settling the mind. This could also be translated as closely settling the mind.
That the never do so the tate don't know the country in the heat of the senator. Sam de pa yin suna young. Kang Jopaji, Sakasin and Jokaji, Latin Yendu said.
And the way that this topic or this method is often explained is that even though your mind still could get distracted, you're very quickly able to bring it back. And you're not only able to bring it back and resettle it quickly, but your mind is able to rest in that state more powerfully than before.
That this Muni Chetan Wadavina send the Tambo say, and Julia basically Chagre. Say Yaga and Ama near the Latis Calico Chagio. That come the night and go samba the days go Nicha Yabu, Nicha Garu, Yellow Dicala, and it's a Lamson Jew to go Jupana Yima, Cassetti, takes in Jupan Jupachi, near to the digital.
And so what we can understand from this is that when we're beginning, it's hard to even rest the mind on the object from the beginning. But, and then when your mind gets distracted and then you try and bring it back again, because your power of your restful state or your abiding state of staying with the object isn't very strong, when you get distracted and bring it back, it's not so easy once you've brought it back to rest there. But here at this point, you're not only able, the power of your restful state or your abiding state has gained in strength such that when you bring the object back, you bring it back really quickly. You notice that you were distracted to bring it back really quickly, but also when you bring it back, you're able to re-engage with that calm or abiding state more effectively. Yeah.
다 데솔라다다 이제 이제는 다리 트레바테레 아니 가세 말에 또 조그노니 아니 트레바테레
No.
이제 이제는 체진기 비제 때가랑
And so this follows the same of the 6 powers and the 4 mental engagements as the previous point. So we're still working with mindfulness as our power of the 6 powers and still working with the interrupted engagement in terms of the 4 mental engagements.
나서다 데데레 데니다 디니마다 도버체도 생기데레도 도버체도 스팅 아바데.
And then the 5th point then is taming the mind.
단디 데네 조가세다 셈 마기 바데소 데네 시버체바 생긴다지 소 데코구도다.
And so what this is referring to, or what we're working with at this point, is that there are still some aspects of our mind which are not utterly calmed or pacified, and we're going even further into even calming those states of mind.
다 가르기시고 말세다 다 나서 빼나 근이양 마기바 차기요래 데네 깜드나 조 증화세 되기다. 데이터 흉좀 차기요. 다 가서디 여기들이 셈데이스만 니용 거봐. 데이스만 니용도 갈라 아니 가서라 고 증화가 못 받아. 된디게 되네. 니라서 받다. 다고 띵인지게 되게 요르발라. 다 같이디 증화도 거봐. 된디는 마기 받아서 담기 되는 쇼르체 봤세.
And so here, what is it specifically, more specifically, that we are trying to pacify? So there are, some unrestful or unpeaceful states of mind that come about through overexcitement of the mind, and some that come through dullness of the mind. And here, particularly, we're talking about dullness because our mind has started to come into a real state of rest through those previous methods and through our development through those methods and through those stages. And when our mind starts to come into a more powerful state of rest, then we start having the obstacle to our meditative concentration, our meditative stability, the obstacle, which we say is the obstacle of mental dullness and laxity.
르가 이익성대서다 마기바 가르기 고는데 자기 예미 르가 이익성대랬더니 영영 다 양자 다 뭐 된지스제 보입니다.
And so here in this state, in this practice of the pacification, then what we're working with here in terms of the 6 powers is the power. Here they use the word awareness. Often this is given the term introspection or vigilance or vigilant introspection even, which means that you again and again check on the state of your mind. You check to see if your mind's getting dull. You check to see what is the state of your body, speech, and mind. And you kind of check in on yourself so that you are aware of what's happening in your mind.
다 데제다 tropatereval
No.
tropate네 남도 발업돼서 당기 마이 받아서 시버체 바세다 시버체도 생긴데 다 남도 발업 차와돼서야 바다 시버체 비도 나다겠다 지단 고고 있어야 돼.
Sorry, I think I misstated. The 5th was taming and the 6th is pacification, but it's the just a difference in names, but what we just described is all the right thing. The 6th is the name pacification. And so here it's like all of the waves of thought, the continued stirrings or waves of thought are further pacified.
다 디니기 급돼서라 다 당모지 남도돼서 마 희와지 드니 참모돼서 양을 희와지 다때 힌트 차와 다른 걸로 요래 다 참모돼서 파 희와지 덴드 집이 급되나다 제된다고 지 용구요 송구도다 용카힘을 희는데 드니 때 스틱팅인 계속 고미하라 먹가와지 용이야 zon다보다 수용바 zon다보다 다때서 용구요세 아니 때솔라더니 년보 베나다 지 공집이 되는 폐요 집에 담바 나마테서보다 배지 야 롱chen ba zon da wona da ore da chesa ni sangji zon da ne longchen ba zon da da de so go pe de ne di na ta de so la je ting yin de ge pe de so tren je ani ting yin de so ma gong bi ge de ne ga za de so kyo kar kar yi mi da pe de da de so thong ngarang la di da pe sem da na pe ji me cha da chim bo lap sa ba da 에드네 니차 참 니차 쳐볼라 저리 대소 탐지 배요 대소 되는데 시바지 아 되니 용돼서 라 되네 제야 돼 되네 쇼좀 송 되네 나도
And so in these fifth and sixth methods, then we're going like to a point where we're taming more subtle levels of thought and even more subtle levels of thought. But even the most subtle level of thought is still there, and that's going to be talked about in the coming stages. But basically what's happening is our mind is overcoming, it is taming and pacifying in these fifth and sixth stages, more and more subtle levels of distraction and thought. And so in these points, what's talked about sometimes in the text, it describes how at this point, sometimes people can become frustrated with their practice. They become irritated with the practice. And when that happens, it's important to think about the benefits of meditation, the faults of not meditating, and sometimes to read the spiritual biographies of the Buddha, of Longchen Rabjam, of other great masters of the past, and gain some enthusiasm for the practice. And so, and to also consider, like at this point, your mind has become very stabilized, very restful, very able to rest in the state of calm abiding. And so to think of the benefits of that and use that contemplation of the benefits of that and the faults of distraction and so forth to re-energize your practice.
집단하지 최진들이 많이 쿠가다더니 벨레로 지야 바 렐레나 방구제 땅들라 나쯤 그제 땅부터 예전부터인데 진당 솔루도 왔어.
So what often happens is that we'll have a lot of difficulties in our mind, difficulties, sufferings and so forth, states of depression or unhappiness or whatever, and we'll see those as faults and we'll start to practice in order to overcome that. But then when those things become pacified, we might work really hard to get to overcome those. But then when those become more gentle and more pacified in our minds, then we become a little bit too comfortable, overjoyed with that. And we just become lazy and, content with what we've got. And we fall into just kind of a content and lazy kind of state.
Then da 같이 듣는지 대잖아다. 니급된 리어다 공아서 공들이 중간에 받체디 로 레닝 다우라 된들라다 고 셈바데 파데 설르르나 용토벌데 양절 나만이 틀로 요래. 소 신이 생인데서 던지 제대로 파디 니문 고나르 공고내야다. 니차 숙세를 조조과들에 마도 양자고 틀로 그래. 나만이 빠지가 차기야다.
And if we practice in that way, then, it's fine in our immediate circumstance. It might feel good in our immediate circumstance. And if you practice for a couple of years, you can get to a state where you've overcome a lot of your difficulty and you feel very relaxed. But if you don't continue the practice, all of that can rise back up just as it was before, because the practice of calm abiding merely suppresses, but doesn't completely eradicate all of our afflictions and sufferings. It merely suppresses them. So if we stop practicing, all of those difficulties and unpeaceful states of mind will just rise back up. And so those three middle methods, the three that we just mentioned then, 4, 5, and 6, those are methods which will stabilize our restful state. And then the final 3, 7, 8, and 9, they'll take that stable state and really bring it to its state of perfection, or it's often talked about as the you're freed from thought, or you become freed within that stabilized state. So 7 is this complete pacification of the mind. And so what's being talked about here, what is happening here is that one is able to pacify even the most subtle level of thoughts. So previously we already went through, in the previous state, a subtle level of thought, but this is overcoming even the most subtle waverings of thought. And here, when we get into the 6 powers, the power of diligence is applied here. So to continue in making progress, one needs to apply this power of diligence. And so here again, with the 4 mental engagements, we are still in the interrupted engagement. And so from the 3rd, from the beginning, basically all the way through here, there's still an interruption in our restful state, and we have to re-engage. So all the way continuing up to number 7, including number 7.
That's it. Oh, did it. Then it down as well as
And now on the 8th method, which is single pointedness. So this is a very, very high level of attainment here. And here at the state of one-pointedness, one has to still apply a small amount of effort, but with just merely the application of a small amount of effort, one can remain in a single pointed state on whatever object that they wish for as long as they want to. And of the 4 mental engagements here, this is the uninterrupted engagement, the 3rd of the 4. So as long as you're applying this small amount of effort, then there will be an unceasing, continuous, application or continuous abiding in this single pointed state.
Oh, that is that. Tandi guba de la ani ta hunjitba jupi
top joking on the taron de sundu rana
teni tanga so hini guba de wala ta hini guba de teni di nyambar joko sigi dereda.
So now on the 9th, it's resting in equanimity.
Tan dela teni da gase ta yizi jigno hunjitbi yizi. Then that dela taco ngamu shusho pa la uya mato jige ani tikela ta sora de sola temugu ta ko ngamu shusho hunji to bitso jibone panjo metela teni yakyor ta dela.
And in this 9th state, the 4 mental engagements, it is effortless engagement. So it's a spontaneous engagement that requires no effort whatsoever.
Della di top program in repeat up say and repeat up say the takaserichi mikpa down the takaserichi the sotanti patan drainy con drainy. Me say tela coaching young jets the yagoya down tendriga the kangam of jaway never taco. 가서 코판 드레지니 또 거랑이 파탄 로드 거다 미바다 남바다선 드레지니 판 로드 기었다.
And so the 6 powers, this is the power of complete familiarity. And so here with this complete familiarity with the practice and with focusing on an object and so forth, then you don't need to feel that you're doing anything. There's no effort required, but it's just a natural expression of your mind that your mind can remain in the single pointed state.
같이 되게 다 셈마니바 되는 니바집이 톱섬 니바 템바집아 템바데아 도버집이 되는 톱섬데 덴리게 고니드니 히니역탑 굿
And so these 9 methods, again, to summarize, the first 3 were the 3 methods to bring your unrestful mind to rest, then the 3 to stabilize that restful state, and then the 3 to liberate or free your mind further from within that state of stability. So I just gave, like, tonight a brief kind of summary or exposition of these 9, because there's a lot more that you could go into, but it would be quite difficult to do in a short teaching.
아니 다절 신이 되라 때는 생지다 세미신이 있으니 인터뷰 잘 요래 단 생지 뒤에 다른 거는 희반하기 걸어서 봐라 때니 반주바 때래 때드네 레 동보바데서 미발라 짠이 건좀 타운든가라 때야고 때야고 좀 통해지 차송하는 아니 가서 미발미 신이 있으니 되네 다고 미발미 신이 되라다 조동 라인가만 다 초가 소소소다 제제를 마두지 니노는 찌기마 다 제트했는데 다 요말에 그 일라 되네 미비게 되네 거라서 봤던데 요요래 대 미비게 거 샘을 미봤던데 용디로 다 된다만 뭐
And so generally, again, there are 2 kinds of calm abiding: a calm abiding that uses an object, and one that doesn't use an object, or they could say with characteristics or without characteristics. So, and so what I talked about in the beginning was the one with characteristics or with an external object. And so that's for beginners, who are not able to rest their mind in any kind of object at all. That's where they begin. So you begin by that, and you learn to focus your mind and rest your mind in an object. And then once someone has become sufficiently familiar with or sufficiently capable in that practice, then they would move into a calm abiding without a physical object. And so those are, there are various types of practices for that. There are some where you would imagine like the Buddha or some kind of enlightened form within you, but you don't have a physical object of it, but you imagine that like within you, or you imagine it in space, or you even just focus on mind with mind. You don't use any kind of object at all. And so there are many different ones. So I can't just say that, calm abiding is like this, because it depends on the particular set of instructions or the particular kind of ritual or practice text that you're learning from.
Oh, that's it. 아니, 다 같이 되니 다 교육부는 힘이 럽드 된바 세대기 때에 되니 토말 담봉가서 공중에서 담지 힘이 대 세지여 받고 그래. 힘이다 떼스지면다 힘이 รับ대바세우다 힘이 약고지 담보들 더고에 계속요래.
And so again, an important point here is like the quotation that I gave earlier from the Way of the Bodhisattva, that is the knowing that the insight, which is thoroughly suffused with calm abiding, will overcome the emotions. So in the beginning, we need to have some level of calm abiding, and not just a little bit, but thoroughly suffused, meaning we need to really gain some ability or some good capacity with calm abiding.
That's it. And that this one that could be finite lata. Ani finite le young people, so same monaya chanam pe, mongoda nyam se the 참아용 되기 어래. 아니 대소 담지다 소소 그게 선이라고 제 때요나요. 다 대라 되는 때지니. 아니 다 대양 지케서 본다. 다 대소 가르가르 제고 유미데. 어떤 데 따지는 거나 야고요레스.
And if if someone is practicing calm abiding, then while practicing calm abiding, you can start to have all kinds of visions, kind of meditative experiences. And then when those are coming up, it's important that you talk about those with whoever you are receiving calm abiding teachings from or meditation teachings from, because they can give specific instructions in order to help avoid any obstacles that those types of visions or experience could have, or to help give other kind of instructions to help increase the power of your practice through working with those kinds of experiences and so forth.
다 대다다 가서 신이들 야운데 어느 데라다 신이들라 배 되니 니마 탑비기죠 다 가서 증거라서 봐 대양 시켰더니 배 하정 니니 미빠들 썰못 타봤다면 다 가서 배나 나래다 식제다 라서봤다 된지게다 라서봤다 마인비 아니 다 문이지 찬양바 세도 내가 미바 마서바 마이바 니무 타바 마이바 덴데지 룹디가라 아니 지 랑통은 로나 답에 무슨소바인 거디가라 신이라비 랑통게세 아니 디가세 니몬 남반 좀 토브레세 ende somore.
And so when someone is practicing calm abiding, then if they get to a point where they no longer have issues getting their mind to rest, so they kind of can overcome the faults of mental dullness and agitation. So they have no problem resting, but they don't also get so deeply in the state of rest that their mind or what they might be imagining or thinking of or visualizing, or just their general state of mind doesn't become clouded by or dulled by that deep state of rest. And so if you can get into a kind of even state where you're also not having the issue of not being able to rest, but you're not so sunk into the rest that your mind becomes dull, then that's the perfect, excellent state of mind, which would be the appropriate vessel for moving into the vipassana or insight meditations. And that's where that quote from the Bodhicharya Avatar talks about, where it says that the insight, which is thoroughly suffused with calm abiding, can overcome the afflictive thoughts and emotions.
당 코비 가서 거기 강가세나 다 같이 돼서 답니다. 그만 고는 좀 제기여 봐지게 아니 랑통되게 곧자와니네 봐좀 두고요 봐 대다 나마 산지베 좀 많이 빈다 저렇게 돼서 참이요.
And so the calm abiding as the kind of particular position or the particular techniques and assertions of Buddhism say that calm abiding can merely subdue or suppress your samsaric difficulties, thoughts and emotions, afflictive thoughts and emotions, and so forth. Whereas it is vipassana, the power of vipassana or special insight, that can completely uproot and thoroughly eliminate them.
나세 되는다 제당게지 신이들 희고나 마스만 보여다 데마긴도 센세 찍바스네 되니 존데 되니 예메 미밍 되니 가세 발라 탐지 되니 신이를 받는데 배차는 희고나 한데야 뭐 대소 탐지라 맹람다 뭐 되니 드스페 뭐 요래 다이나 가서 드린다 더 good 소리고 희나 아니 되는 잡게 됐어.
And so within the text describing calm abiding, there are so many other things that could be talked about. There are all these different levels, and they all have their different names, like the single pointed mind of the desire realm, all the way up to and including the state which is called neither existent nor non-existent. These are all names of levels of or attainments within a practice of calm abiding. And so if we wanted to get into all of those, there's so much that could be talked about in the scriptural tradition. However, I wanted to give a more succinct and concise explanation of calm abiding, and so I did so tonight by way of these 9 methods.
Yeah,
So I'm going to leave it here for tonight.
And
if you all have any particular questions, I could take a few questions. I think you might have to type them in the chat. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to turn on your microphones. You can see the Shiba Ngapa Drupa than Sorianchi pay Tombora ring out of the Tambo Suma, the Shaler Sama Tango and the Rajarola. And the Corchix.
The some tango whom do Marilla.
Did Marie the chick or let Tambo Payana, the Nichik the Tambo Sumbora Chile and she shoot chair out some tango or Marie.
That tango the Mintu in Jugdona and the Koya lived to your now. Yeah, lived to your
I was just saying to Khen Rinpoche, it seems that like when we talk about these, that the starting from 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, they seem like very high states. And like for a lot of us that are beginners in this practice, the first 3 seem like more applicable or more, easy to understand or more applicable to our own experiences. And he said, yeah, that's true. But if you are practicing diligently, then you will move into those other stages, certainly.
Sanji Chomden de Tata Naso di Jagal Temochi Tino Dawanila, Tene Casere, the Sheni Dumbala, Lapsoma is a Rinpoche. That Rinpoche Koya, that did lava mason, and it's like Capsal Pandua, like Capsal.
And so, if we think of the Buddha Shakyamuni went to his first teacher, Rinpoche, and within 2 months of practice, he accomplished all the way up to the 7th of these 9 methods and transcended what Rinpoche could actually teach him. And so Rinpoche said he didn't have anything more he could teach him. So he sent him on to his next teacher, Plachap, to continue his practice. And Chi namto tramo se the country chick go langore digi semgi chick pay yo tramo dava chick segure the so like singing get pay chungchun dava chick go where resa. So Judy said, can you give an example of subtle thoughts? Is it like a subtle movement of the mind or like a whisper?
Oh, Cassiango, the dig mate, Caringo. Benesenda Tambokas, Benam to Balap.
Oh, really?
To be cheddar. Said it, he did you.
Lao Yamna.
That the negati where he did you start to pitch down Momburis and that Tambo de la Pena, that wrong, the Puchetapos, the Chesaji wonder what is it. And the Jima from home to be cheddar with it, and then Dinima joked with it. Hama there, Maggie jumps on Nona. Jumps on the long they say, yo, they pay down the journey, all that in this genita. So
I can give you a little example. I won't get into all the details, but there is another description that often goes along with these teachings on calm abiding called the 5 experiences. And they're experiences of like examples kind of to show you what your mind might feel like in these states. So the first one is that your mind would feel like turbulent water cascading down like a waterfall. And then the second one is like a mountain stream that's just flowing more gently down. And then the third one is like the flow of a really gentle river. And then the fourth is like a pond that from a distance looks still, but when you get closer to it, there's still ripples on the surface of the water. And so I'd say that like, just as an example of subtle thoughts would be like, from a distance, it seems that it's still, but there's still some wavering or some movement, just like the ripples in the pond.
And then the soap tower that up in the jumps all a 7 long to pick up this one over this. So in a patch, so soon will some bounce on a time, not to go over May, somebody. The ditching years. In a delicate Shaki tower, Mata did it, certainly the young would took the ditching,
But, just like that example of like a gentle breeze going over the top of a pond, like from a distance, it might look totally still, but up close, you can see the movement. Similarly, our mind might, for us, on a, in our experience, we might feel that our mind is utterly still. But when we go deeper, we start to see and realize that there is still some subtle movement in our mind. So it's like that. And particularly, we will know how stable our mind is when we meet with some adverse circumstances. That's one. Ani digi da shine shakta good and so le anchik di dorji tabi kabla chik country jargorist penalty chik cherem dan zorim dil.
Denita kaseri yakta ta ki benandana kaseri de da ko mende ji kaim do se ta pena pe chana bu ji yawa ina ta tango sem ju go se na gi chini kaseri na so ko la tene pa eni tene kaseri jopa te da bu ji la tene di ko ko rba se na ti ta jigin drang jani so jamni nge ta da he de ji jeram no ya jade ji te da yo mare se ba la kaseri ti ba ko ma la tsare ba ina ko ter kaseri hini de ya go re. And
so to Ali's question, how these appear in the context of Vajrayana practices like creation and completion, Khen, she said, just like one simple example would be like the first state of resting the mind is like when you're visualizing the deity in creation stage, then you should have a single pointed like focus on that visualization. But realistically, these 9 don't have to directly apply to these Vajrayana practices. That's a whole nother level of practice. The general principle of calm abiding applies to that, but we shouldn't try to force this principle of 9 methods onto another level of practice that it doesn't strictly apply to. That's kind of like a tying knots or like connecting things that aren't really connected. So generally calm abiding, the principle of calm abiding applies to creation and completion stages, but not necessarily the 9 methods. And so I assume that you're a Vajrayana practitioner in asking that question. And so to get into the very specific descriptions of the creation stage, when we talk about creation stage practice, there is something called the 3 samadhis. And the first one called the samadhi of suchness, this meditation on emptiness. Actually, you're supposed to stabilize your meditation on emptiness until you've gone through all of those 5 stages of experience that I was describing with the different levels of movement of water and stillness of mind and so forth, before you even move into the visualization of deities and so forth in the 2nd and 3rd samadhis. The same the nedig dus chik samnayang bete mukdeng in derni dinichi chadre yosarawasa.
Di da
and the kandichi mozin
di hinidam anikasere sem de da mokni ni de ti ni de yenje tsehigores.
So Danielle asked, can we delude ourselves into thinking that our mind is calm, but it's in fact dull? How do we know for sure? So yeah, you definitely can. You need to know how to distinguish whether your mind is just restful because it's dull or whether it's actually in a state of calm abiding. It's like I said when I was describing the character of calm abiding, or the definition of calm abiding, that it is single-pointed focus on a virtuous object, not a single-pointed focus or single-pointed rest in a state of dullness. And indeed,
that they cook as a repedi, they go same lazy magician, the Tongcha Korong Yomare, not ni Yome Koron de Kohu Yomare, Kasi same thing Lekachi Yomare. That's he need the same thing Lekachi, Kotata, Pagimipa, needle, needle, teach by Charlie.
And so the difference between those is that when your mind is resting in a state of dullness, then it is not workable. It's not functional. It's just dull and unaware. And you need to be able to recognize the difference between that and this functional clear, restful state of calm abiding, which is functioning in seeing its object clearly. Whereas in that state of dullness, that aspect of insight or of clarity of the experience or clarity of your vision of whatever your object is lacking. And so you need to be able to distinguish that.
Then that the song that pena that so the sao that the so come down in the toru to support here. They see the negas in parties team Zuko some good chart so they say jogo or the song.
And so, you know, sometimes it's like if we have if we're overheated or if we have eaten a really big meal, then we can start to feel really dull. And that's a time when we will feel really dull. And so you should try and avoid that. And also sometimes it's talked about as other methods for clearing up a state of mental dullness that that you should turn down the heat in your room. You should take off a layer of clothes. You should kind of stretch out and like get your blood circulating better in your body and, you know, things like that to freshen up or to clear up that dullness. And so it's like that, like you should really set limits, like in how much food you're going to eat when you're practicing and so forth, and also when you're feeling that dullness in your mind, it's important to do some exercise to wake your body up and so forth. Ani chik di nga sat namjun deni chik choga daw chik druptap daw chik nyamnen che dena ani di zur de le an chik shine chik gom gona di chik bete chik choga phasha ani tutu shemba chik la shine chik nyamnen che yasare be la khandu chik chibures
ane that thing that he shivana get so young car la teman data than road for it chirum de kiram da den ro ko kiram da den ro de khron din ni hini ti chong de hi ore ina de ro jung che gora tambo de ka se thiba da samba da tribit top so gogur ba ta ni kiram che ge ne de che gor ma to yang chi ya ta go sing ni pha ti hi yo ding as ro chi so choga de pha so de na yo ding as ro de ma je be che se ba ko choga da sang choga na jin khron la pe de ka shini da nam chuma yore de tambu na go tsum che any di tum phando na den tigres da de la so ba kaya mena ane ka ti ya ta gola so ba tamu honi nya ne je ni ane dini ka ri choga de phan jog na ane ka se ya boresila.
So I can say two things here. So for one, like if this is coming to Diana's question, if you're practicing a traditional sadhana regularly and wish to enhance insight through more calm abiding, what's recommended for time spent outside of sadhana? So for one, it's not, if you have the resources, the creation stage practices in your sadhana, you know, if you can get the instructions, if you have the access to that, it has its own set of instructions. You know, those creation stage practices have their own way of practicing calm abiding in the context of creation stage. And so if you do that, then you should, you know, work with that. And then if you don't, or if you don't feel like that's the way you want to go, then it would be good to do some sessions, like practice a session working with these 9 methods, like with the image, like I described, and then you know, wrap up that session and then go into your normal sadhana practice.
가세다 띵노 띵파 수대반다 고친 판도 탐나 야그레 마도 근데 띵파 소리야 옌바데 람네야 아닌 로마 히비체는 디용고 말해서.
And so in the in other traditions, they do have some practices which are what we would call mere creation stage, like creation stage by itself without an incorporation of the perfection or completion stage. But in the Nyingma tradition, that doesn't really exist. Every practice of creation stage is a union of creation and completion practices. And you know, if you can, it's best to practice in that way and try and bring that power of calm abiding into the sadhana practice instead of trying to completely separate those things. It's better to try and integrate if you can. Any the the sem de yanchik de or temba do chik sing jiwala the pena or sem chik yang song samado chik yang chik muk song senda yang go song samado chik the tonang chinging sem de jiwala the core chik song nan the chik the sem de country in mendo
let's say temba
the temba in consist segment the chik yang song ge tonang chinging ge chik leb ding ge ta chik oh da yang song sam ge sem chik leb ge dola yang muk de ge do star chik the tonang chinging ge sem chik dola yang good those strategy don't changing the chick same day do
let's say that the pache ji dang da the temba
so Peter said could you speak of the nature of that mind that notices it has wandered off or is dull or excited, because one notices that that there's some attentiveness that is present there. Yeah.
temba say the kandachili yabi said semina your cake that and never even touch taking a cookies, touch taking any mato, the day you're making that sent the yajo mares.
So just generally speaking, when we're talking about that mind that notices, we're talking about mindfulness. And so when we talk about any state of mind always has to have some associated object. There is no state of mind which doesn't have an object.
And it's like that temper said inti meaning debi chuchil mingejile tatiko debi chuchil mingejile temba ase.
And when we talk about the term mindfulness, we're actually talking about mindfulness. Its object is something in the past. It's like remembrance is another translation.
Ta pena nga ta da pha gum jubi samcheni ta ko de pha yani tene mayin pa kinma mentuni den ro de la ya.
And so when we start a session and we have this intention of like, I'm going to meditate now. And then that sense, that mindful presence of awareness that I'm meditating stays with me throughout that session. That's mindfulness.
Ani ta yang di par land song na semba yemba ji ke ni par de par chen ro na yang and so when
you then lose your attentiveness, you have your flow of mindfulness of your object has been cut off by some obstacle, by some distraction or whatever. And then we regain that mindfulness, or we could say we remember what we were doing is another way to put that. Then that mindfulness, that remembrance of what we're doing comes back and we're able to rejoin into that sense of meditation. And so when we're practicing, we need to really rely upon this power of mindfulness. It's a very important factor that we are mindful of what we're doing, of our object, that our mindfulness, keeps that presence of our mind with its object. And also being mindful in terms of not forgetting what we were supposed to be doing. Like we got these instructions from our teacher, we now know how to practice. And if we forget their instructions and we forget what we're supposed to be doing in the practice, that's a really big problem. And then normally when we talk about mindfulness, we always talk about mindfulness together with the other quality of that vigilant introspection. And so that introspection again is that sense of being aware of, or really checking in on what's happening in your body, speech, and mind. So often the that vigilant introspection is talked about as like a lookout person. It's really checking up to make sure, what's happening in your body, speech, and mind. And so in the Bodhicharyavatara, the way of the Bodhisattva of Shantideva, he says that our mind is like an elephant, and mindfulness is like the rope that ties our elephant-like mind to its object. It holds it with its object. And then vigilant introspection is like the lookout person who's seeing if the elephant slipped away or not.
No. Oh, that is
and there's also so many different ways of talking about mindfulness. It continues from these fundamental principles of mindfulness all the way into much different kind of higher level discussions of what mindfulness is or could be. Ani di nganso de shine shatab gu go ne chi gom jabna ani nganso tuchi khande chi la chi gom jane yagare da khamni shu sum chira chi gom na yagare yang dile ring ora chi gom na yagare khar chi gore sa
let's say ani da nganso pena chitang ge dini shine gom dong da le tambo ba da tes gom ba da pena gom ba chembo da dindi chiba.
So Alexander asked, is there any amount of time we should aim for, like 20 or 30 minutes or even longer? Khen Rinpoche said, so it just depends on, if you're a beginner or if you have some familiarity or if you have a great familiarity with the practice. And so for a beginner, it's always said that you should practice short periods, but many periods. And so the point of this short period is that you don't want to deceive yourself. You don't want to like trick yourself just thinking that you're going to meditate for a long period when you're actually just distracted or whatever. You want to make a shorter attainable amount of time that you're going to be doing something meaningful with that time. And then once you have familiarized yourself with that, then it's important, that what's considered important is extending that out, like gaining a longer continuity of that meditative state. And then, like I said before, like you can continue that all the way through where you're going from this point of short periods and then extending that and extending it more and more and more until you no longer even need to apply any effort, and it becomes this spontaneous presence of a single pointed mind. And so some more important points is that you don't want to be practicing with an unclear state of mind, but you also don't want to be practicing in a state of mind which isn't able to rest in its object. And you also want to not be overly stubborn or overly forcing yourself to practice such to the point that you're actually making yourself irritated with the practice, because you can get to a point where you feel reluctant to practice because you're not, you're forcing yourself to do it. So you shouldn't do that as well. And it's generally said that morning is the best time to practice.
Ni shuka de sine ta li tambo ba so shu jamma yana. Tene ko kali gom de la trova de la mo de panzam de la ngaso ta trova ti lu ya ta ko. Ti trova de ma lo ba de la gom na ma sum ba ti kali do la panzam de la so so lo uni ti chowa da trova ti la mo de. Ani ngangu shu shu bi ti ma jo se na ti to la tene jo ro me. Cha ne tene pe ti nguni so so se na sa wa da de wa da. Tene ta del pe nyam drama da pe mo sha do ji re. Ta ti ta so lo na tene ko rang yin ge ti.
So, but in the beginning, one does have to apply some effort. One needs to have some real effort in the practice because you need to gain that continuity. You need to work hard until you gain some real, what they say, the enthusiasm of the practice or the real flavor, the experience. You gain some experience of the practice. And then when you start to really get that enthusiasm and that real taste of meditation, then you won't even need to, kind of think about or kind of put effort into wanting to practice. You'll naturally want to practice. Even if someone said, don't practice, you'll do it anyway, because you'll be really enthusiastic about it. Oh, right. And so also, there's, when you continue in the practice, you can get into this state where you're gaining these experiences of bliss, clarity, non-conceptuality, and so forth. So, and those will just come about naturally when you gain the enthusiasm in the practice. Yeah, until I check the shamanana tang song ni chik Thomas. Don, I don't really understand your question. What do you mean by this practice? Because you're talking about two different things. Like this practice in terms of like focusing on the image of the Buddha and like the 9 methods. I think this was kind of answered before with Diana's question. Tadi ganga chua de chipuchi ganda chik chua chik chisona. Tadi chik choga tan nyamdu dini chik jargona da chik de nganso de tagas desha ni dini da gewi mikpala chik se chik to dini chik gongor be de yang choga ge nang lola chik the choga ge mikpara chila se chik the shane dini chik che yor be singing da chik
naze ani nge tari ngo ni shibana ji de pede ko shini changba gome ji na ngora changbo de sengje jongla tini kasi de moma da ji ba de tham ji ja de yong ta pe ne ji ka ju sa cha ge lo ta so la kasi de di shini choga de yode ta pe ne nga so tin nam ja da wo ji ne so mo ji de kasi shini gi di choga de yode ala de ta de shini de bona ya gres di che bang de choga se na ta la ngi ya wo ko hum do ko che shini gi choga ni
So anyway, like there are lots of different kind of sadhana practices, and there's sadhana practices that are even specifically for practicing calm abiding, and other ones that are related to creation and completion. So if you're merely wanting to practice calm abiding, then you should focus on a practice that works around calm abiding. Like, for example, this is a book that is written by Tukusanga Rinpoche, and it's available through Namchag Publishing if you want to check this book out. But anyway, that book, contains like the methods and the practices for calm abiding. And otherwise, it's like I said before, how practicing with a creation and completion sadhana practice, they have their own complete instructions about how calm abiding can be joined with that, and you need to learn that separately. Lasso adi ngochi
ore la se tini ta da nga so la tini ta ni di tini sa so ani ore ta di ka so ngama de me ka hi ji ko o ti ke byo de se de sing da tini nga la tro nge de ka pa pa da de chi de se ani de yang ka hi shi do ani ta ka se de tini de che de jasen the easy then the Casereta here song the any da song you the summer that check it in the Nangi and it 나서 냠데 되니 베냠네 다 가서 힘이다 정말 되니 되니 나게 요새라.
And so Khen Rinpoche said that's the conclusion of my calm abiding teachings tonight. And also there are some people who were asking me who my translator was, because people don't know who I am. And so anyway, this is Justin, and Justin has been with me and has been translating for all of my teachings for some years now, including our summer Shedra programs, and also has been, doing all of these practices with me, like calm abiding practice and receiving instructions and doing the practices and so forth.
Yeah. Oh, so in this one that Justin to teach.
So anyway, thank you to Justin. And also thank you to everyone who came here to learn tonight. And good night, everyone who's at least everyone here in the States.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everyone. He said every means lots of things. One means one thing. What does this everyone word mean?